Hi there. Welcome back to our class on 1 Corinthians. Today we are in Lesson 8, Chapter 7, verses 1 to 17. Now, if you have the schedule or questions, you will notice that I have changed the title. I have actually been wrestling with Chapter 7 for quite a while. And I have just come to the conclusion that it is not all about marriage and divorce. It's mostly about the rule in all churches. So, we are going to read 1 through 17 from chapter 17 today. Sorry, from chapter 7 today. And we will delve into what Paul has told the Corinthians in answer to something they wrote to him. All right, let's read. Now, for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. And in the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent, for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am. But each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Now, to the unmarried and the widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried, as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband. But if she does, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the believer leaves, let it be so. The brother or the sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Okay, I have to tell you, I struggled with chapter 7. And if you've had history reading with chapter 7 and discussing the things in chapter 7, you know how divisive it is among the Christians. And I have really prayed about this and asked actually for some enlightenment. I've read several commentaries, and I want to simplify this for you today. For me, I need it to be simple. So I am giving it to you simply today. Okay. I will also tell you that not only did I change the PowerPoint some with the title, there may be some other changes in there because of the struggle that I've gone through. This is actually the second time that I've recorded it. So we took the other one down because I just wasn't happy with it. And so this is the revised version. All right, your question number 1. What prompted Paul to write to the Corinthians concerning marriage? Well, verse 1, now for the matters you wrote about. So they had written him about it. Now it says concerning marriage. I'm taking that actually off. What prompted Paul to write the Corinthians? And so they had asked him some questions, evidently, in a letter. And before we jump into it, I want to remember at the very beginning we talked about Corinth and how it was just immersed in paganism, in sin. There were there were all kinds of temples to different gods in Corinth. And each of these gods required certain things during their worship. To us, some of the things that were required are shocking, such as the goddess Aphrodite. Her temple worship, of course, she wasn't real, but her temple worship required that one had sex with a temple prostitute in order to worship her. There were other gods that required other things. And so it's very different from our world, from what God, our God requires. So they are coming from this pagan background where when they went to a temple, they needed to know what this God requires of them. Now they were following the God of creation. They had pledged their lives, their blood, to the God of creation, the only God. And they wanted to know how to please him because this God loved them. He loved them so much that he sent his only son to earth, and he died on a cross. His blood flowed, and he was the sacrifice for their sins. This God sacrificed for them so that they could be his children. And I think it was important for them to know how to please him. And that is why they wrote this letter to Paul. Now, we don't have the letter to Paul, do we? All we have is Paul's answer to what they wrote about. It's like a one-sided telephone conversation, isn't it? You're listening to someone talk and you think you know what they're talking about based on what they're saying, but you can't hear the other person. So that's where we are. And I'm going to make sure when we read Paul's answers that we understand, try to understand what they're asking. Now, is that presupposing what is happening? We don't know for sure what they asked, do we? But we can know what they did not ask. And how will we know that? We will know it by Paul's answers. So let's go to his first answer. Now, I asked you question number 2, considering the answer in verse 1, what might have been the question? We'll answer that in just a little bit. But he has written about, they have written to him about some matters. And his first answer was, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Okay. Well, that's an interesting statement. In fact, my version of the NIV has it in quotations. I found that interesting because other versions did not have it in quotes. But anyway, I want us to look at that because in light of what God created in Genesis 1, this answer is odd, isn't it? Because Genesis 2 verse 18 says, the Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him. And then in verse 31 of chapter 2 in Genesis, he said, it says, God saw all that he had made, and it was very, very good. Okay, so the word good here in the Greek is kalon, and that's K-A-L-O-N. It has 2 meanings. It can be used 2 different ways. All right, one of the meanings is just good, expedient, profitable, wholesome, honorable, excellent. You know, those are synonyms. Synonyms. They are synonyms for good, wholesome, honorable, excellent. Another way to use good, or kalon in the Greek, is comparatively. All right, meaning one thing is better than another one. Well, this is good, and this is better, okay, or gooder. Well, here, Paul is using it the first way. All right, so we need to understand that Paul upheld marriage as sacred and God ordained. Okay, he was a Jew. That was very important. If you read the other letters that he wrote that are in the New Testament, you will see that he would never teach against marriage. It was important to God. But here we have, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Is it good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman if he's single? Yes. Is it good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman if he's married? No. Evidently, Paul didn't think so either. Let's continue with verse 2. Since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife and each woman with her own husband. All right, so he's saying here, yeah, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But, verse 2, a man needs to have sexual relations with his wife. A woman needs to have sexual relations with her husband. Because, I mean, he's really indicating that, do they not know where they are? Where are you living? Corinthians? You're living in Corinth. It's the one of the most immoral places in the whole Roman world. You walk out your front door and you're hit with immorality right and left. Is that a little hard on a marriage? Especially if you are abstaining from sexual relations with your wife or husband? I would think so. All right. So, maybe it should be, the question was, should Christians refrain from sexual relations? Yes. But we go to verse 2. If you are married, it's going to be very difficult for you to maintain your purity if you don't have sexual relations with your wife. Okay, that's important. That is God ordained. That pleases God. Okay. Then he goes on and talks about the husband fulfilling his marital duty to his wife. This is important for them to understand. The wife doesn't have authority over her body, the husband does. And he's very equal here. The husband does not have authority over his own body either. He's not allowed to go out there and partake of sexual immorality. She has control. His wife has control over his own body. Okay? All right. So, this immorality, because, well, there is so much immorality in Corinth. So it is good for man to have sexual relations with his wife. All right. Now, I think I skipped question number 3. We pretty much answered that. Question number 4, is Paul's answer in verse 2 a low appraisal of the marriage relationship? I think in the past people have thought that it was. Well, since there's so much sexual immorality, I guess you really should have sexual relations with your wife. No, we've already gone over what he meant by that. Okay? Okay. Now, in my PowerPoint here, I've got advice to those who think married Christians should abstain from sex. And that's basically what we've been talking about. The sexual relationship in marriage is both a duty and a privilege. It's a privilege. Like I said, it's God-given, God-ordained. But Satan has taken this privilege, this gift that God gave a married man and woman, and turned it into something immoral. When it's between a husband and a wife, it is very moral and very upright. It's a gift. It's a privilege. And as we read in verse 4, it's a duty to uphold the sanctity of that marriage. All right. Question number 5, is the sexual privilege of a husband and wife approved by God? Of course. Of course. And I came up with a question, maybe. When a couple become Christians, should they discontinue the sexual relationship? No. All right. And then he talks about abstinence. He said, do not deprive each other except, perhaps, by mutual consent for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Now, your question number 6, when is it wrong for someone to withhold their body from their spouse? Well, you go back to verse 4. It's always wrong to withhold if it's not mutually agreed on. So, never withhold the privilege to get your own way. No. That's not good. Now it says maybe deprive each other if you both agree, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Let's look at that. Some couples together have decided that they would fast in this way. Okay? You can fast in all different ways, not just with food. Some fast this way. But he's saying you need to come together. It needs to be a short period of time so that you won't be tempted. What did he say here? Come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So, now, why would you fast for that? Well, if you have a big decision to make, maybe you might want to do that. Do you have to? No. You don't have to. But some people do. Now, sometimes there is a crisis that happens in your marriage or in your family. And you just can't, neither one of you. But at some point you need to come together and love each other in that intimate way, and hold on to each other. So Paul is definitely in favor of marriage. He's really looked. I think a lot of people look down on him because of this, but no, that's not what he's saying. That marriage is bad. Now, question number 7. What does verse 6 indicate? I say this as a concession, not as a command. It could have been talking about the married couple abstaining and then coming back together. He could have been saying, I'm not saying that you have to do this, just that you can. As far as depriving one another for a short period. But he could have been talking about verse 7. So let's read it in that way. Verse 6, now I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am. You see how it could be for 7 or for 5? Okay. So I wish that all of you were as I am. Now, what is Paul talking about? Paul is not married. He is unmarried. Do we know if he's ever been married before? We don't. I will say that the Jews, it was very important for a Jewish young man to marry. At least, let's see, by the time he is, 20. No, approximately 18 is the average age. If you were 20, you were a bit old. Okay, but still within that range. But you were looked down on if you had not married your betrothed by then. And so it's possible that Paul had been married sometime earlier in life. We don't know that. Now, Jesus was not married. He was 30 years old when he started his ministry. So evidently you didn't have to, but it was looked down on you if you didn't marry. Now, he says, I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. I want you to keep that in mind about these gifts. Especially when we're thinking about verse 17. I want you to go down to verse 17 right now. And I'm going to read it. Each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord assigned to them, just as God has called them. And he will use this phrase in verse 17 2 more times in this chapter. And right after that, just as God has called them, he says, this is the rule I lay down in all the churches. And that's why I've named our lesson that, about the rule. But he now is about to get into talking to 3 groups of people. So he's talked about the gift in verse 7. Each of you has your own gift from God. He's talked about himself being unmarried. So, he's going to talk about 3 groups of Christians with different gifts as far as male and female go. The first one is going to be to the unmarried. The second group he will talk to is the married. And the third is the married to unbelievers. And right after this is when he says each person, nevertheless, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Now, this is the ESV, I believe. The NIV says each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord assigned to them, just as God has called them. All right, and he's talking about these gifts. Peter talked about gifts too. 1 Peter 4 verse 10. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. Its various forms. And I want us to think about that. These are the various forms of gifts, aren't they? All right? And there are spiritual gifts, but I want to focus on these gifts because evidently Paul considers his unmarried state to be one of his gifts. Okay. Now, he is answering questions for people who were confused, maybe, as to what their life should look like after they became a Christian. Remember, in chapter 6, we talked about how they had been washed, they had been sanctified, they had been justified through the blood of Jesus. Paul taught in Romans 6 verse 4 that they had been buried with Christ through baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, we too may live a new life. Now, again, were they unsure of what their new life was supposed to look like? All these other gods required things of them. What did this God require? I know that Paul had spent a 1.5 years with them, teaching them about the things of God, but evidently they didn't quite get it. Maybe they just didn't understand that when you get a new life, you don't have to leave your old life. Like, you don't have to separate from your married partner. Rather, the new life that we receive as Christians comes from within, doesn't it? We have the Spirit that lives in us. And that is our new life. That life that we have inside us, that Holy Spirit, affects the rest of our lives. Okay? It affects all parts of our lives. So, I don't know if that's what they were thinking, but it seems they were definitely confused. So, from verse 17, it almost seems like they were thinking that God just called them randomly. Okay? He's about to talk to these three groups. And he's going to be explaining to them, God didn't call you randomly. God is a God of purpose. And if he called you when you're married, then you stay married. All right. So let us consider now what he is about to say. Let's read his answers. Now, here's advice to single Christians. Now, he answers, we're not going to talk about the question yet, because we need to get the answer that he has given them from what they wrote. Are you ready? All right. Now to the unmarried and the widows. He's talking to unmarried widows. Who are unmarried people? Anybody that doesn't have a husband or wife. If you are not married, then you're unmarried. Okay? You're widowed. Or you've been divorced. So, to the unmarried and widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Okay, so is this a difficult question? Evidently not, because Paul uses 2 sentences to answer it. So, just looking at these 2 sentences, what might the question have been? He added this, it's better to marry than to burn. But the question might have been, should unmarried Christians stay unmarried? Does this answer that question? It is good to stay unmarried. It is better to marry than to burn. It's better to marry than to burn. Okay, I would say yes, because he said, all right, if you're married, if you're unmarried, it's really better to be unmarried, or it's good. But if you have a problem with sexual immorality, if you don't have the gift of absolute self-control in that area, you need to get married. It's better to marry than to burn with passion. All right. I'd say he answered that pretty well. Okay. So, now let's go on to the command for Christian couples. This is to married. To the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. Now, when he says the Lord, a command from the Lord, he is talking about Jesus. And he is talking about what Jesus said when he was on the earth. So, he's giving this command from the Lord. So, listen up. A wife, let's count the sentences. I like to do this. A wife must not separate from her husband. But if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. Done. Moving on. This is where people get so bogged down. I want us to look at this today and figure out what might have been the question, keeping in mind that Paul answered this question fully. He answered it completely. Paul could be very wordy, couldn't he? If this question needed more to it, needed more of an answer, he would have answered it. But he answers this question with 3 sentences. Let's read them again. 1, a wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. All right. What command did Jesus give that Paul is reciting here, basically? Turn to Mark 10, verse 9. Mark 10, verse 9. And it says, Jesus said, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So he says a wife must not separate from her husband. Okay. A wife must not separate from her husband. Now what about, it has to have something to do with divorce and remarriage, because it has the word unmarried here, and it has, remain unmarried and divorce. It's got those words in it. Wait a minute. What question was it that they asked him based on these 3 sentences? If we are talking about divorce and remarriage, and the only reason Jesus gave for divorce, what was it? Adultery. I don't see that in here. Was that a command from the Lord? Yes. But Paul did not answer that question, did he? The only question he answered was, should Christian couples separate? That's the only question I can figure out that this answers. Okay? From the Lord, they must not separate. Now, if a woman separates but doesn't divorce, she can't remarry, can she? But she can still come back to her husband, yes? Okay. And then he flat out says to the husband, do not divorce your wife. Okay? They just needed an answer. Okay, we don't know what, or should we separate? No, you must not separate. Okay, can we move on from that question? Great. All right, let's move on to the question that Paul did get wordy on. All right, way more than 3 sentences in this one. So, instructions to Christians married to unbelievers. This was a big question back then, okay? To the rest, I say this, not the Lord. Now, the Lord didn't say anything about that. Why? Because there were no Christians then, no believers in Christ crucified. Why? He hadn't been crucified yet. He had not risen from the dead. So, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. All right, so that's 2 sentences. Another one. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the believing wife has been sanctified through her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the believer leaves, let it be so. The brother or the sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? 8, I think. 8 sentences to the married with those married to unbelievers. So let's look at this a little more. Let's see. The answer: you must not separate. Not if the unbeliever is willing to stay. If the unbeliever is willing to stay, you stay together. So this is what I think the question might have had something to do with. Should a Christian leave a spouse who is not a believer? No. Okay. Now, why might this have been an issue? Well, this was actually a complaint in history, if you read the history back then, that the Christians had been accused of tampering with marital relationships. Also, so that's one reason why maybe they were asking this question too. Some Christians, as we have already seen in the earlier chapters, have gone a bit overboard with their human thinking and logic. Okay? Some may have an overabundance of piety, thinking that the unbeliever is not worthy to be in the presence of, in the same home with the believer, and so they need to separate. Well, that's not true. Paul sees it the other way around. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. Well, we'll get to it now. But, and I'm skipping some of the questions just because I don't want to take forever. And I just went a different direction than some of the questions were. So, your question number 13, what was the original plan of God concerning marriage? One man, one woman, one life. And does God recognize the relationship between a believer and a non-believer in marriage? Of course. Yes, he does. In fact, 1 Peter 3, 1 and 2, wives, in the same way, be submissive to your husband, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Okay. So, this verse 14 is confusing because it has this word sanctified in there. And sanctified means, remember, set apart. Set apart. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife. The unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Well, does that mean that this unbeliever is saved just like the believer? No. No. But that relationship, that marital relationship is sanctified by God. It is sanctified by God. So, Matthew 19:8, Moses permitted you to divorce, but it was not this way from the beginning. God doesn't want you to separate. So, now, that's why I said Paul thought of it in a different way. Instead of the believer tainting, instead of the unbeliever tainting the believer, it's the other way around. The believer, by their lives, will be an example to the unbelieving spouse. The wife who has an unbelieving husband, this husband will see changes in her and see how the Spirit is living in her as she uses her spiritual gifts. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. These will be evident in her, and he will notice that. Well, what about the husband with a believing wife? The husband with a non-believing wife. The non-believing wife will watch her husband. She will follow her husband and see those same things in her about how he's treating her now, how he treats other people. So that marriage is still sanctified by God. Just because you are a believer and an unbeliever does not mean that marriage is not sanctified. He goes on to say, otherwise your children would be unclean. but as it is, they were holy. Okay, if you leave and you break up that marriage, evidently their children might have been considered illegitimate. So that's not what happens here, but Paul infers that their children would not be clean. They would be looked down on by other people. But with the sanctity of marriage, the children are holy. Children are holy anyway, we know that. But we're talking about the marriage, the unity of this marriage and this family unit. All right? So, verse 15, if the believer leaves, let it be so. The brother or the sister is not bound in such circumstances. All right. Now, not bound. What does that mean, not bound? Let's read it again. If the unbeliever leaves, if the wife leaves the believer, if the husband leaves the believing wife, Paul said, let it be so. The brother or sister is not bound in such circumstances. Okay. Bound, not bound. Bound, not bound. Either you're bound or you're not bound. It's like being pregnant. You're pregnant or you're not pregnant. Okay? So it has to mean the marriage vow. If the unbelieving husband leaves, you can't do anything about it. Then Paul says, God has called us to live in peace. No matter how much you nag him, no matter how much you push him or pull him to be a believer, you talk about it all the time. Paul says, God has called us to live in peace. If the unbeliever leaves, then you have to let him go. And you are free after that. Have you ever had close friends or family that are not Christians? And it just breaks your heart. It breaks your heart that they're not Christians and that they can't see. Why can't you see? But again, no amount of nagging or pushing or pulling is going to get them to see, to understand, to believe. So you need to let them go in peace if they're an unbeliever. In verse 16, he explains this. How will you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Now, this is talking about, it's just talking about Christians who were married when they became, well, it's about people who became Christians in that marriage relationship. One spouse became a Christian, the other spouse did not. He or she did not believe, did not want to believe. This is not talking about a Christian, already a Christian, who chooses to marry an unbeliever. Okay? We go with the answer to the question they asked. It was not about a Christian marrying an unbeliever. It was about two people who were married, one became a Christian, one did not. Are you with me? Okay. Okay, on to verse 17. Nevertheless, all right, he's just finished saying, wives, how do you know whether you will save your unbelieving husband? Husbands, how do you know you will save your unbelieving wife? It's upsetting. And so he says, nevertheless, pay attention to what I'm saying to you now. Each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Okay. So in conclusion, whatever situation you were in when you were called, live as a believer. Always live as a believer. Always follow the commands of the Lord. Number one. And remember, the Lord didn't call you randomly. He meant to call you where you were. He is a God of purpose. You were chosen where you were for a reason. Don't know the reason all the time. But again, he doesn't choose randomly. And where you are, where you were called, is important to his kingdom. Next time, we are going to finish chapter 7, where we will talk more about circumcision, about slavery, and about some more things between men and women concerning marriage. I hope that I have not thoroughly confused you, but I tried to make it a bit more simple, because so many times, to me, people want Paul to say things in this chapter that he just doesn't say. And we've got to be content with what's in the pages of this letter to Corinth. So I look forward to being with you again next time. Until then, have a blessed week, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.